We also have a certificate of attendance for anyone that's here today live, and we just ask you to complete a very short survey that will pop up at the end of the session, and this will allow us to create the certificate for those who are collecting continuing education credits. We're also looking for any feedback you have or topics you'd like to see, and we welcome that feedback regardless of the certificate. In terms of housekeeping, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so feel free to unmute yourselves at that time or use the chat. So today we'd like to welcome our panelists, Emily, Greg, and Margaret, who will be sharing their expertise with us. So Emily has 8 years experience in hospital-based clinical research. She is passionate about team building, mentorship, and employee development. She has a keen interest in improving patient quality of life and healthcare navigation, process improvement, and positive change management and project management. Emily is currently a clinical research manager in the Cancer Clinical Research Unit at UHN. Greg is currently professor and program coordinator at Seneca College for the Clinical Research, Pharmaceutical Regulatory Affairs and Quality Operations and Cannabis Regulation and Quality Assurance programs. Prior to transitioning into a full-time role in education, he was manager, research quality and privacy at the Applied Health Research Center, an academic research organization located at St. Michael's Hospital, where he was responsible for overseeing both the internal and external quality programs. He has held numerous additional roles in his career, including manager of the Research Ethics Office at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and Research Quality Improvement Specialist, where he was instrumental in the development and implementation of the risk-based monitoring and quality risk management program at this institution. He has both an honors Bachelor of Science and Masters of Science in Pharmacology from the University of Toronto and is CCRP certified. He also recently completed his term as a director with SOCRA. Margaret is a clinical trials expert with broad drug development knowledge. She has over 15 years of experience working in the clinical research field. Margaret is currently a senior clinical operations lead at Hoffman-La Roche with a focus on study management at a Canadian and global level across multiple therapeutic areas. Through her career, she has held a variety of study and people management positions across CRO, hospital, and sponsor settings. So thank you to all of our panelists, and I will pass it over to them now, beginning with Emily.
Thanks, Emily. You can click through probably the first bit of the intro as well, since you did go over the bio, which is great. So as Emily mentioned, oh, I guess that didn't get re-hidden, but we can still add that in. That's okay. We can just have it go in the chat because I don't think the Slido was working. So as Emily mentioned, I'm currently at Princess Margaret Cancer Center in the Cancer Clinical Research Unit, and I manage a team of frontline coordinators working in various different trials in both medical oncology and surgical oncology. So you can go to the next slide. So we'll maybe go ahead, and if you just want to drop this in the chat. So there are just a couple of questions that we can get to know you a little bit better and where you're at. So where you're at in your career journey, and then also kind of what you hope your next steps or move might be as well, just to kind of give us a sense of who's here today. So if you want to start putting that in the chat, that would be awesome. And you can go ahead, move ahead, Emily, thanks. And to the next one as well. So I started out, I guess, my research journey in my undergraduate program. I took an integrated science program, which was a research focused program at McMaster. And I also completed a lab-based thesis there. And from that, I wasn't sure that I wanted to commit to doing a full master's degree in a lab-based environment. I also thought about med school, which I think a lot of people do who end up in clinical research, and really wasn't sure. And I was honestly Googling cool college programs or competitive college programs in the lab while I was waiting for some of my cells to process, and came across the Humber program. That's honestly how I found out about it, which I know sounds silly, especially being in a research-based program, but I think sort of clinical research was still kind of new to me at that point. So I ended up going to Humber. And then from there, as a part of that, there is an internship program like there are for a lot of the post-grad clinical research programs. And then I ended up coming over to University Avenue, which I'll talk a little bit about on the next slide. So I started off my internship from Humber. I was at Mount Sinai in surgical oncology as a clinical research assistant. I was working mainly with the sarcoma, retroperitoneal sarcoma team there. And then I progressed through different roles. My clinical research coordinator role, I was working with both the sarcoma and peritoneal malignancy teams. As the peritoneal malignancy team didn't have a research coordinator and didn't really have a robust program built up at the time, so they were sort of testing those waters. And then I was able to move into that full time with that program, and was there for just over 5 years at Sinai. I hopped over onto the other side of University Avenue to Stick Kids, where I went into more of medical oncology. So I was with the clinical trial support unit there with the Department of Hematology Oncology, and did mostly neuro-oncology, and then kind of moved into sort of the sponsor side of management for investigator-initiated trials. And from there, I hopped back onto the other side of University Avenue and ended up at Princess Margaret. I don't want to say it was by chance, but I definitely wasn't actively seeking jobs at that point. But this role did come up and come available, and just being in the hospital environment for a while, I just knew that these types of managerial roles didn't come up super often. And definitely getting into sort of that team lead, leadership, mentorship piece was something that I was looking to explore and see if that was something that I did really enjoy. So I applied for that, and I've been here for like 20 months, I think, coming up on 2 years. So yeah, so you can go ahead to the next one, Emily, thanks. This one, again, I don't think will work, but if you want to pop some of those into the chat too, in terms of what you're finding to be your biggest obstacle or most challenging piece of trying to figure out where you want to go in your career or making those next moves. We can maybe talk a little bit about that in the Q&A session as well. Thank you. So I just put together a few different types of resources and kind of the hows you can sort of make your way through the clinical research side from the site perspective. And then also I think these things can help you if you do venture off into some of the other avenues like Greg and Margaret will talk about later. So a big thing, and again, depending on where you're at in your career, it may not make sense to go back and do a postgraduate program in clinical research, but there may also be other types of postgraduate programs out there that can help you to build skills and foundational knowledge. You know, you really want to get into data or project management and kind of start pursuing those types of programs. So it definitely can help you and give you a leg up so that you actually can kind of speak the lingo and have that foundational knowledge. Seeking out experience within your current role, I think definitely ask your current manager or PI if there's any other ways that you can get involved within the research program or the institution. There's also a bunch of different ways to get involved with REBs or Clinical Trials Ontario or N2 and other initiatives that you can kind of do to help set yourself apart. And I think making connections, I know it's been really challenging over the last few years of the pandemic, but I recently was able to attend the annual SOCR conference, and I felt very like energized by being there and just, you know, connecting with other individuals in the industry and seeing what else other people are doing and other avenues that I myself could potentially be getting involved in terms of different research projects or and just even like how we run clinical trials. People everywhere always want to know what other people are doing. So there's definitely lots of ways to get involved and make connections with people that way. Okay, next one. Oh, sorry, I guess you don't have to go back, but just that one other point that I had about reaching out effectively on LinkedIn. So I often find that I do get a lot of messages from people on LinkedIn. Some of them are just connections. Some of them, you know, have a very brief message, but I actually do read them, and I'm way more inclined to reply to the people who send a message like asking a specific question or, you know, not just making a connection on LinkedIn without actually leveraging that. So I think be thoughtful about that when you do reach out to people, especially if you're reaching out to people who may be getting a lot of types of connection requests, just because they may be more inclined to actually open up that conversation with you. Okay, and these are just some other additional resources, which I won't go into everything. Kind of talked about a little about them before. But definitely, especially for the hospital side of things, becoming a SOCR member or ACRP to get your CCRP can definitely be really helpful and is required for some of the roles on our matrix to move up in the various roles that are available in the hospital. There's also the opportunity as well, I think, which can be really helpful, and more so at my time at Mount Sinai. It was more of a combination of clinical research and academia. So being involved with different projects and writing papers and submitting abstracts and manuscripts and all of that. So I think there can be a lot of value, especially depending on if you want to get into some of those areas that may look for more of that sort of knowledge translation or deeper understanding of different diseases and their processes. So that can be helpful to kind of look for those types of roles if that's something you think you want to get into. And I know I have a couple of friends who did take a graduate diploma at Queen's. For anyone out there who has their PhD or their pharmacy degree or MD, there's definitely lots of opportunities to get an internship as well directly with pharmaceutical companies, which I know half the battle is getting your foot in the door. So looking for things like that. And then just really starting to think about what you actually want out of your career. And can be helpful instead of just sending your resume out everywhere, putting some more thought into that. And I know sometimes you may have to try things to figure out what works for you and what doesn't. And I guess I want to highlight that that's also okay. Being in a role that I do hiring, I see a lot of people are kind of jumping from job to job. And I think there really is a lot of value in staying in your role as long as it's not like for other reasons and like too mentally taxing or just really doesn't align with what you want to be involved in. But there is a lot of value in actually staying in your role and really understanding what happens. And there's other ways to get more opportunity or more exposure as you kind of become more senior in your role. So I just noticed that people kind of want to get to the next step. And I think that that's really representative of kind of this just fast-paced world that we live in. Everyone's kind of always looking to the next thing and sort of instead of trying to kind of be content with where they're at while still making moves to kind of help progress you into those next potential roles. Like for me, for example, I know that the work that I've done in my previous roles has really helped to set me up in being the best manager that I can be because I understand what my team is doing. And it's easier for me to support my team on various levels. So just something to consider and think about too. And then that's it for me for now. You can connect with me over email or LinkedIn if you want to chat further. And I know that we'll be doing a Q&A once we hear from Greg and Margaret. So I will pass it over to Greg. I believe it is next.
Thank you so much, Emily. So, you spoke to and kind of set the stage for some of the things that I'm going to go into in a slightly different and maybe a bit more goofier fashion, because I think I'm at that stage of my career where I can kind of make fun of myself a little bit more. But, I'm going to be echoing a lot of what Emily already mentioned with regards to kind of how my career progressed. And so I'd like to just thank you all for coming out today and listening to this, and hopefully we get a chance to ask some questions and have a great discussion afterwards. Could we go to the next slide, please? So I think when you have people coming into clinical research, there's a lot of thought that everyone kind of knew exactly where they wanted to go, that their path was very, straightforward. They knew exactly where they wanted to go. There was never any doubt about what their other career might be, right? That it was all planned out. Now, unfortunately, I think for most of us, and in my case, especially, Emily, if we go to the next slide, it looked a little bit more like this, where it was like, where am I going? How am I going? Am I going to go take this exit? I think this is actually a real road in Dallas. And so it's, I hate to have to travel through this, but I felt like to a certain extent when I was going through all of this, that this looked a lot like what my career opportunities look like. I wasn't sure where I was going to go. I didn't know what was even available for me. Universities at that time were a little bit less focused on telling people what jobs they were potentially suitable for. It was more just like, well, this is the knowledge that you have. You need to figure out what you're going to do with that. And so I kind of left not really knowing where I was going to go or what I was going to do. And there was just a lot of confusion around kind of what my path would look like career-wise. Can we go to the next slide, please? So with regards to kind of what my kind of career looked like, I've had a few different opportunities along the way. So I started, as Emily mentioned, when we started kind of with a background in pharmacology. I always really liked drugs. It sounds kind of weird, like not taking them, but learning about them. But if you do like taking them, then hey, that's good for you as well. So I was doing pharmacology. I like learning about how medications worked. I didn't necessarily really consider research as an option, and I never completely never thought about education as a career option. 100%. There was no chance around that. But I finished my bachelor's, and I would say I was pretty poor around planning, and so I thought, okay, well, let me apply to different things in the life sciences. But I hadn't really cultivated the skills that made me marketable to join the life sciences field. So I wasn't really successful there. I was actually working in security, which I had done a little bit of work in, and I was just spending the whole time being like, I don't even know what I'm going to be able to do with this, even this skill that I'm picking up, working security. Now, go forward many moons forward, you realize that those skills that you pick up around de-escalating situations, so that you don't get, you're able to kind of calm down a situation that you walk into, actually ends up being a very valuable skill that you can apply in any situation. But that being said, I didn't go to school to work in that field. And so I realized at that point there really wasn't, or I wasn't aware of those options around potentially taking a clinical research program. And so the closest thing for me was to continue and do some research. I had a chance to do a little bit of it. And I thought, well, you know what, it's a bit of a 2-year endeavor. Why not? I'll give it a chance. So I had applied to a master's program, and I thought, if I get it, I get it. If not, back to the drawing board and figure out what I do. I was lucky. I got a spot. I was able to interview with a couple of people. Some of those interviews went well, some of them not so well. We can talk about that in another session. But what ended up happening there is I ended up having a chance to chat with who would become my future supervisor, who's doing clinical research at CAMH. And it sounded great. I was like, okay, it was clinical research. It seemed something that I was interested in because I liked working with people. And so I thought, what a great, opportunity. I learned later on when we were recruiting for the next batch of students that one of the preferences that my supervisor has isn't necessarily academic prowess, but rather that the person left the field and decided to return. Because if something has drawn you back, you really want to be here. And I thought, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. I never thought of it that way. I always thought, which is probably how I ended up there, right? Because I'd taken some time, stepped away, and realized I wanted to come back and learn something new. Now, I was given a few projects. Some of those projects didn't go so well. They were very ambitious, but I realized when I walked in that there was a lot of stuff I didn't know about. I learned about the science, but I didn't understand that there's this whole process that supports studies, right? What's a clinical trial application? What is GCP? What are the regulations that, kind of structure this industry, that you can't just go out and just give random medications to people and think all is well? Like, what's a research ethics board? All these kinds of things that I wasn't necessarily fully aware of, I had a chance to jump into. And during that time, I realized, okay, wow, this is something that I'm weirdly find interesting. The stuff that everyone else was like, the obstacles that they had to overcome to get their study started, was the stuff that I kind of found interesting and fascinating. And so that really kind of got me interested in learning more about that. So I would say that I spent just as much time in grad school learning about regulations as I did about the actual science behind things. And so I found that kind of fascinating. And that happened by chance alone. Being that I really didn't have much planned at the end of that process, somebody on my committee was like, hey, what are you doing after? And I was like, I don't know. He's like, do you want to come and work for me? He's like, I have a translational research lab. My background is in preclinical, so I focused a lot on the preclinical side, but I need to develop my clinical lab. And I figured, since you're already here and you know how things go, and you seem to, have an interest in this kind of operation side of thing, would you be willing to come and work with me? And so I went and I worked with him for about 3 or so years, helping develop that clinical lab in that team as a research analyst. Working in that area, I had a chance to work with the QA team in much more depth. And so I got to know the QA manager, and then the QA manager said, hey, I'm looking to develop this monitoring program. Would you be interested in coming and working with me to help develop this program? And so I jumped from that area and then worked as a research monitor, helped with some stuff on that end. That role essentially transitioned into quality improvement specialist, where my portfolio expanded. But during that time, I had this opportunity where Seneca College reached out and said, they reached out to N2 and said, we're looking for people to help develop courses. And I thought, I don't have the expertise for that. But I was lucky that my boss was like, well, throw your hat in the ring anyway, see what happens. You know, they're looking for someone to develop the monitoring course. Maybe that's something you can be involved in. So, okay, I'll see what happens. And so I jumped in and threw my CV in, and I got an interview, and I ended up getting on board as a developer, and then ultimately then became a part-time faculty member, taught in 2 different schools, eventually ended up coordinating the part-time program. And so I was kind of involved in a variety of different things at Seneca in a variety of different capacities. And so that's kind of got my initial interest in education, and realizing that, oh, I actually kind of like this too. And so I continued to do that. I then had an opportunity to jump into the ethics side. So it's a different side of the coin, I would say, QA versus ethics. Jumped into that, did ethics for a little while. I was then really fortunate to be able to be elected to the SOCR board of directors, which for many of us, and I don't want to make this, I obviously have some biases around SOCR. I really enjoy it and I really like my time there. But I felt that for me, SOCR gave me a lot with regards to my own personal development and my own professional development. And I was really glad that I could give back to the community and could help give some ideas around how we might be able to engage our membership in a different way. And that was a really interesting opportunity. And I was really happy to be able to do that. Emily, could you go to the next slide, please? But at the time, I realized that my interest again still kind of laid in quality, and so an opportunity jumped out to go to the ARC at St. Mike's in a research quality role. And so that was really interesting because I get a chance to kind of work with so many different people and support a variety of different investigators and helping them come up with quality plans to make sure that their studies were running effectively. And that was really great, but it required a lot of travel, right? Because we were doing a lot of monitoring, so it was a lot of travel. And I came to this essentially fork in the road where I was like, okay, I either have to give up teaching, which I really enjoyed, or I have to sit there and think about how I kind of stay at St. Mike's and do that, or do I consider teaching even part-time? I was fortunate that a full-time position opened up around the time I was contemplating that decision, and I ended up applying for that role, and I was successful in getting a full-time educator position at Seneca College. Fast forward a few years there, and then I ended up becoming program coordinator for a number of the programs there. So that's kind of what I do currently. So I support students and faculty in making sure that the programs are running effectively, making sure that students are meeting their learning goals, and supporting faculty and helping develop courses and modify courses, etc. So that's kind of what I do currently. Emily, could go to the next slide. So with regards to my career approach, this is kind of how I went around, right? It's whatever came up. I was kind of strolling down the river, and if there was a spot where I could kind of hang out for a little bit, I'd hang out there, and I would learn everything I could about that spot, because for me, I was really interested in just learning as much as I could about the industry. It was really helpful. I'd go to as many conferences as I could, speak to as many people as I could about something, read all of those regulations that puts people to sleep. But I just really found that stuff interesting. And so I would kind of find a little pocket. And if I found that area was interesting, I would kind of hang out there for a little bit. But like every career, Emily could go to the next slide, there are going to be some times where you hit some rapids, and you go through those rapids and you're like hanging on for dear life. That's just the honest truth. It's going to be within a particular job where you have busy times where you're, in some cases panicking. In some cases, it can be full out jobs that are just absolutely bonkers. And you're just, you're just trying to figure out, how do you survive within that confine? Now, those rapids, I think for us are very important, because the calm times don't really necessarily stress us, right? We really grow when we hit those times where we're really pushed to our limits, i.e. Being in these rapids. So what can we learn from that, right? Well, the things we can learn is, well, what's the type of work do we enjoy? Do we enjoy that kind of rapid environment? If that's the case, and most of the time what I find is if you're in kind of that type of environment, having the expertise to be able to rapidly make decisions because you already are backed up with that knowledge really helps you to feel comfortable in that scenario. Not having that background can really be challenging, right? You may ask yourself what challenges give you the most fulfillment. You can kind of figure out what leadership styles may work with your own interests. Are there people you can work with? Are there people that perhaps you're not necessarily seeing eye to eye with? Something from your own internal perspective is what techniques might you be able to use to overcome your own stressful situations and kind of learn from that. And think about how that experience can help you both personally and professionally in growing and becoming a better individual. So those are, I think, some steps that or some takeaways we can get from those kinds of things. Can we go next slide, please? And so my last slide, just a couple of books I would like to recommend. I really learned a lot from these. So I think the one on the left, the So Good They Can't Ignore You, is really helpful for those who are interested in a career in clinical research, because many times when you're in school, people ask you, or they say, well, just follow your passion. And a lot of people say, well, what the heck is my passion? I don't know what my passion is. And a book like this really kind of threw that on its head. It says, if you get really good at something, you can then become passionate about it because you know the nuances. You become so good that, well, they can't ignore you. That's actually the title. I was, so that's kind of a thing that you're thinking about. And what it says is you want to be bringing up and having as much expertise in the field as you can, so much so that your career changes from you seeking out positions, but to people seeking you out for those positions, right? That you have been able to make a impact in the industry such that you become the person who gets sought after. I think that's a little bit an ambitious goal, and that doesn't happen to everybody, but it's something that's kind of interesting there. The 80-20 principle for any of us who work in quality, I think that's a really good book to think about, is thinking about how do you get more done with less time. If you're a perfectionist, I think this is a great book to read because I think it really helps you restructure how you approach work and how you approach things. It's not a guide to being lazy. It's about a guide about figuring out what's fit for purpose, if I'm going to take some industry terms, and not get held up with trying to be perfect in different areas. And then Mindset, which I think is a really good book, which I really think should be required reading in high school. But it really talks about how do you grow as an individual. There's the fixed mindset and there's the growth mindset. And I sit there and I think about the fixed mindset. I said how I was, I was thinking about how I did in calculus, and I was like, well, I'm just not good at calculus. Well, why am I not good at calculus? Well, I don't do my homework and I don't study, and then I don't do well in the tests. So therefore, I'm not good at calculus. Well, that's a fixed mindset. I either have a skill or I don't have a skill. The growth mindset, on the other hand, is, well, Greg, if you study and you do the questions and you practice, you will get better, and then your grades will get better. You can grow and do better at things. And that's kind of the crux of that book. But I will leave that there as just a few books and a few recommendations, and I'll hand it over to Margaret to hear her perspective.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I love listening to all of this. I almost forgot I needed to talk because I was taking notes of a few things that I thought were cool we could pick up on. But I'll put a plug in as well for that 80-20 and growth mindset, Greg, that you've called out. I love that you've put them in here, and are definitely things that I live by day to day and draw upon very regularly. But hi, everybody. Very nice to meet you. I am Margaret Molnar. I'm a senior clinical operations lead at Roche. And if you want to take us to the next slide. I wanted to start just by sharing a little bit about who I am. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself before I jump into my content, and I will tell you my slides are nowhere near as beautiful and professional as Greg and Emily, but I hope my content will be just as engaging as theirs. So I live in Oakville with my husband and two boys who are now 10 and 13, and my 1-year-old standard poodle who doesn't sit still long enough for pictures. So I've pulled a beautiful photogenic dog from the internet that looks remarkably like my dog and put him here because I love him and I'm very proud of him. I am a lover of desserts and all things chocolate. So I am very excited about the holiday season that will be here before we know it. I love to read. And although I aspire to always have books like the ones Greg has recommended to you on my night table, I'm usually reading historical fiction. And I will say that I usually find that I need to spend time in the outdoors to recharge. So you'll very often find me camping, cottaging, gardening, or hiking. And that's where I get my energy back to make sure that I am full and fresh for the work week. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my career journey so far. So similar to the other presenters, I have a background in science. I did my honors Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and Math. And I will share, as we're among friends, that by fourth year university, I realized I really didn't like chemistry very much. I did not like working in the lab, and I wasn't very good at working in the lab. And I started to wonder, what am I going to do now that I have pursued a degree in chemistry? So I think this was one of the first times in career that I leveraged some help to help me work through this in my mind. And I'm so grateful that I decided to take advantage of guidance counselors that were available to us at U of T, and just to really share. I've done all of this work. I am getting my degree and all of this studying in terms of what I thought I was leading up to. It's not actually what I want to do. So can we explore what is possible and what options might exist for me? So this was a really cool experience, and working with somebody to kind of help me really think about, what do I enjoy doing? What skills do I bring to the table? Where do I thrive? And where do I get a full away reaction? What kind of work do I not like to do? And kind of through my work with the guidance counselor, I realized that I love teamwork. I love collaboration. I have a passion and interest for science. I find all of this work really, really fascinating. And she presented an option to me of clinical research. Had you ever heard of this or thought about it? Because it seems like a mix, as I saw it, of project management, of working with people, and combining my interest in science. So I thought this sounded interesting. I started doing some learning, some coursework in this area. And the first job that I had was working in a CRO. So a small CRO focused on phase 1 and bioequivalence clinical trials. And I held a variety of different roles there, starting as a clinical study manager and then moving into some supervisor and manager roles. And what I will say about kind of my experience at the CRO was a really cool learning here, because it's a small ecosystem when you're working in phase 1 and bioequivalence work. I was able to get involved in protocol writing, ICF writing, managing busy clinics with healthy volunteers coming in, all the way to report writing. And within a CRO setting, if you haven't worked there, particularly those clinics that are managing healthy volunteers coming in to do this work, is you're working with a really high volume of patients. You're working with a high volume of data that needs to be processed very quickly, because it is a really fast-paced, competitive environment, and there is a high level of quality control and of audits taking place. So this was really, as I look back, an ideal learning ground for me of what could happen from a QC and a QA perspective, and that full spectrum of clinical trials, but really building in that people aspect as well, that I was able to work directly with patients coming into the clinic and wearing a variety of different hats. I think this was also a place where I first started learning. We're looking at science, we're looking at teams and collaboration, but we're also running a business that we're looking to get drugs to market. And there's definitely strong business drivers working in the CRO setting and deliverables to be put in place. I spent a fair bit of time working within the CRO setting and started to realize there was a lot more to clinical trials than what I had exposure to, and was interested in how do clinical trials work within a standard of care setting with patients who are coming with disease for treatment in a hospital setting. And an opportunity came up at the Princess Margaret Cancer Center for a clinical research manager that I was really intrigued by. Because it combined kind of a new learning ground for me and working in new settings. So I decided to move over to the Princess Margaret Cancer Center, where I've spent a fair number of years. And this was really eye-opening and very interesting for me, because I had moved from a heavily structured, highly controlled environment with layers of quality control and resources and audit built in, into working in a hospital setting with oncology patients in a standard of care setting. Working across industry studies, academic studies, and cooperative group trials. So a great learning ground. I had no experience with oncology prior to starting at the Princess Margaret, so also a really good area of therapeutic learning for me. So when I really think about my early time at the Princess Margaret, it was an area of really significant learning for me about how clinical trials could be integrated as an option of care for patients and what this looked like within a standard of care setting. I think from this time, I carry a lot with me still to this day, because it built for me a really great empathy for patients in terms of what they're kind of bringing to the table when they decide to participate in a clinical trial, and also the day-to-day of what happens in a hospital for a patient to move into a clinical trial and for this to be integrated into their standard of care. So many learnings for me. Here, I was working as a people manager as well. So a lot of kind of the things that Emily had brought up were part of the skill set that I built here at the Princess Margaret. After spending some time there, I decided to make a move again to Roche. And here I want to share a little bit. We've talked so much about career and learning and educations and skill sets, but part of why I also shared my intro slide about who I am is we're all bringing our whole selves to work, and we need to make decisions very often about what we want to do in a work setting, but we also often have to make decisions about what works for us best personally to make sure that we're bringing that work-life balance, we're building all of this in. So I think part of my move to Roche was I had a long commute to go to the Princess Margaret. I live in Oakville. My children were small at the time and something had to give. I really had to make a better balance for myself and recognize the long commute wasn't doing me any benefits as well. So I was looking for new learning. I realized I had worked in a CRO setting. I had worked in the hospital setting, but I didn't understand or know what would happen on the sponsor side. So this opportunity came up that was a really good fit for me personally because it was very close to home, but professionally as well, because it helped me build a skill set I didn't have. I had never worked in industry before. So I've been at Roche for about 8 years now, holding a variety of different roles. I had started at Roche as a country study manager, so I was responsible for implementing clinical trials in Canada and the US. Most of my focus at that time was in the oncology setting and working with teams here and external stakeholders and sites as well. I then took on a people manager role where I managed our country study management team across the oncology and non-oncology portfolio. And as of last year, moved into a different role again, where I mix some of my local expertise as well as work on a global setting as well. So that brings me into my current role. And what do I do right now at Roche? I will say we have moved into very broad job descriptions at Roche. So any senior clinical ops lead you meet from Roche may do very different things. But for myself, as I said, I focus both on local and global operations and multiple indications. I focus on study operations, strategy, and really enjoy the level of collaboration I have with external stakeholders. I think one thing I do find very interesting in working here is my network is global, that I love that I have colleagues located across the world that I work very closely with and collaborate with in this hybrid setting. I really need to focus on broadening my impact. I work on a lot of different initiatives with different teams responsible for helping to catalyze change, provide vision and strategy. And another kind of key passion for mine, I think maybe similar to Greg has learned in terms of his interest in education and learning, is I love coaching. And I've put a lot of focus in my personal development over the last year or two to understand, how do I build a coaching skill set to help individuals within the organization and to help teams within the organization. So I right now focus very heavily on study operations, as well as how do I act as a coach within my teams. I think, Emily, if you take us to the next slide and my final slide. I spent some time thinking because this is such a cool topic. If I were to give myself advice at the beginning, if I'm going back 20 years and thinking, what would I have told myself then? This is what it probably would be. So I'll ask you all to consider this and whether you're living it or maybe you need to do a little bit more of it. And I think we could all do this. And I think Emily and Greg will probably agree at any point in our career. I would say be really open to new experiences. I think as we've heard today, if you don't know how to do something you haven't done before, but you're the least bit interested, I think give it a go and try it because there's so much to learn in any new experience. And I've been, I think, being very eager over time is to raise my hand when new opportunities came up. Brings me to my second point, just lean in. Just give it a try. The worst that you can happen is failure, and you will probably learn something from it, be stronger for it, and do something better in the long run. I would also say ask questions. And this is something I really try not to shy away from, that if you don't know something, probably somebody else doesn't as well, and it only is a benefit to your learning. So to ask and to be open with what you know and what you don't know, as well as to ask for help. And I think this is something perhaps I've become more comfortable with over time in my career, to realize what I can and cannot do and when I need to ask for help from my colleagues as well. And another important piece is to ask for feedback. I think we all have a very clear picture of how we think we present to the world, where our strengths are or where we need to develop, but it can be interesting to ask others for feedback and see where that aligns with our vision of ourselves and where there's other aspects we need to bring in as well. I love that Emily called out kind of building a network and using it in her slides. I will say I'm not so good at LinkedIn. So Emily, perhaps I have something to learn from you there. But where I love to kind of build a network and use it is to really try and reach out and build connections. I've never had somebody say no when I send them a note and said, could we meet for coffee? I am curious about what you do. I'd love to learn more about it, or I have questions. And I will say people are very giving and open with their time. And as we said, worst case, somebody could say no. So I found a lot of learning from asking people if they would give me 15, 30 minutes to have a coffee to learn something new. Again, I think I'm repeating a little bit, but really focus on broadening your experience and have fun. Enjoy the journey. Perhaps early in my career, I worried a little bit more about what was next, where I was going to go, kind of what was possible. But I think as you work through it and raise your hand for different experiences, definitely a lot of fun that's to be had along the way, and a lot of colleagues that become friends. I think that brings me to the end of what I wanted to share. So maybe we'll pass it back to Emily. I think you wanted to open up some Q&A.
Yeah, that's great. So a big thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their experiences and their career journeys with us so far. So we'll move into a Q&A portion of the session. So at this time, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions to Emily, Greg, and Margaret, or you can use the chat if you're more comfortable asking your questions that way. So I'll start off with some that have come through. Emily, I'll direct this one to you because you spoke on networking. So if you could share any additional insight or tips on growing your network.
Yeah, I'm definitely no expert at that either. It can be challenging, and I think something for me that I need to get over personally. It's kind of a mindset of sort of like, well, why would someone want to spend time talking to me? But kind of like Margaret was saying, people are generally pretty happy to share their experience and help people grow. And again, making that connection works both ways. It's not just necessarily for the person who's reaching out. There may be mutual benefits to both people. And again, even just help, like feeling for me personally when I've done it, I really know that I would have liked someone to talk to when I'm kind of in these like career forks in the road, like Greg said, or just sort of when I'm not even really sure what's out there. So I think knowing that I can give that to somebody else is something that I appreciate now. But again, thinking like reaching out on LinkedIn, seeing sort of like checking out what people's career paths look like. And like Margaret said, like calling out, like, I'm really interested in this part about your career path. Like, is there a chance that we could meet to talk about that? I think being specific in what you're actually trying to reach out for, again, just as opposed to like a general connect, can be really helpful. Attending different conferences or meetings or getting involved and not being afraid to kind of network with people. Again, I still get a little nervous sometimes, and especially I found it challenging with the virtual conferences, to be honest. In person, I feel like I'm much more likely to just strike up conversation with people at conferences, but the virtual setting can definitely be a little bit more awkward. So I think being comfortable being in those settings, speaking up, because probably everyone else wants to meet people too. That's why you're there. So yeah, asking, I guess, building your network that way too. There's often lots of times opportunities for support from the current job that you're in terms of attending conferences or being involved. So asking your current leadership if that's an opportunity as well, because I know sometimes that can be a little bit inhibitory too, but conferences can definitely be a good way to build your network.
That's great, thanks. All right, we have another question.
Sorry, can I just add something to that?
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So, and this is not, you know, I think it's just, for me, it's a way I conceptualize this a little bit differently, is the thing for me is I think about it more as like relationship management, right? Professional relationship management. And Emily, I like the fact that you kind of brought up the fact that it's a two-way street, right? Like, as an individual looking out for, you know, for some guidance, you know, maybe thinking about, you know, how can you also give back to that individual? And so in my career, I've been really fortunate that I've been able to cultivate strong relationships with colleagues. And I think for me, that's gone a lot further than having a really large, kind of you know, a network, so to speak, that I have a few trusted colleagues who I can work with and who we support each other, and that ultimately we kind of help propel each other and kind of move along the career field, is something that has worked for me as well. So that's something that, you know, you may want to consider as well, as thinking about how do you maybe devote a little bit more time to these trusted colleagues who you may have in your circle, and that you essentially become like a group that supports each other in achieving your next goals as well. But you know, to reiterate with Emily, it's like, you know, reach out to people too. You know, you never know, those people may actually end up becoming those really in your close circle through those initial discussions. And I'm a big fan of having conference friends that, you know, every conference you go to, you meet up and you have a chance to chat and connect, and that's some of the fun of conferences, right? So yeah.
That's great. Thank you. All right, we have a question that has come through. So what should be the ideal time in staying at one place or position?
I can take a stab at it first, or Margaret, if you want to go ahead too. I think we're all about to start talking at the same time.
Go ahead, Emily.
I was just going to say, I think that really depends, and kind of like Margaret and Greg talked about, like, what are you actually looking to get out of that role? Why are you in it in the first place? And sort of what do you think your next steps might be? So I think a lot of things can also happen organically when in the role, again, developing those other opportunities that may be outside of the scope of what that role was intended for as you become more experienced. So I think looking out for those, and it might be more of like a feeling as opposed to a certain number of years for every person. Kind of, do you feel stagnant? Do you not really feel like there's any opportunity for growth, or that you're not really even interested in looking for opportunities for growth in that area, is sort of what I would say. I don't think it's a one size fits all.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have another one. So what advice would you give to someone starting out in this field, or someone who's new to the field for advancing?
I think I can take a stab and let others jump in. I think advice I would give is, like we've talked about, being really open to different types of opportunities and not getting fixed that you only want a certain type of role in a certain organization. There are so many opportunities available to us in this area in clinical trials in lots of different aspects. So I would say my advice would be to be really open to new opportunities. And as I think Greg had mentioned, even if you're not sure if you have the right skill set, give it a try, because there are a lot of transferable skills as well within clinical trials and outside of clinical trials as well that you would be able to use to your advantage.
Mm-hmm. We have a question about volunteer positions. So are there any volunteer positions available for new grads that any of you could highlight on, if there's any that you know of?
I think it would also be helpful to have clarity. Do you mean like new grads from like master's and PhD programs, or is this a new grad from like a clinical research program? So I definitely think there are different considerations for where you're, what kind of new grad you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. So whoever asked that question, if you want to just let us know what specific type of graduate you are, we can go back to that. We have a question about positions in research. So a lot of positions in research are contract positions for 1 year or less. Do you have any suggestions or ideas on what types of positions are long-term?
I think that, again, it's the nature of research. Sometimes there are positions that have timelines because of grant funding. I think other times companies are trying to also seek out if that's a good fit. But I would say that I definitely see a lot of positions that are more on the permanent full-time scale. It depends on, I guess, where you're looking, like hospital or industry. So I think it probably just depends. And again, there's always going to be contract positions like based on filling maternity leaves or something like that. So I think those may always still be around, or again, if it's a defined time in terms of a grant funded position. But in my experience also, I think sometimes when those roles or those contracts do come up for an end, if you've done well in the role and you've made those connections, you may also get the offer to switch to another team internally. So I think, again, becoming involved or making those connections within the institution that you're at or other sites that you're even working with for your research projects, I think that can be helpful. I don't know if Greg or Margaret have anything to add to that from their sides.
Sure. Well, there's something, so for me, I've always thought of kind of positions, and obviously I'm speaking more from the academic sector, as kind of infrastructure positions or project level positions, right? And so the project level positions I find are generally those positions that are going to be contract based, because it's impossible for an investigator who's kind of planning on soft funding to say, hey, I'm going to have you here for forever. I also feel that there's sometimes benefits to those contract positions, because there's no hard feelings if at the end of that year you decide, I'm going to go seek out something different. So it's actually can be beneficial to both parties. Like, you may actually say, well, I'm only giving this person a year's commitment. No hard feelings if at the end of the year I go somewhere else, right? So there can be some benefit, particularly early on in your career. I sit there and think about kind of, if you're looking for more long term, I'm thinking of like infrastructure, like you're in quality assurance, you're in ethics, you're in management, you're in one of those positions that is, has to be in place at that institution in order for everything to function properly, and kind of maintain that day-to-day functioning. So that's kind of where I would see those positions. I find are generally more permanent in role. But that being said, you have to work up to that type of a job through, in my opinion, through gaining a lot of technical expertise that you can only really kind of pick up by doing those one-year contracts and learning as much as you can along the way.
That's great. Thank you. Are there any additional educational programs or certifications you'd recommend? So I know, Emily, you had mentioned some of the post-grad programs, but any that any of you have taken and would recommend, or additional certifications?
I hope I'm okay to give a bit of a plug to a program that we just launched. So I was fortunate to work with a number of colleagues, and we developed a data management course that we offer in continuing education, where we're really teaching people how to use, kind of really get to know data management, what that's all about. We train students on REDCap and how to, develop data management plans and things of that nature. So there are opportunities for learning once you're in the field. I always find going to conferences is really helpful. There's no conference that I go to that I don't come back with a million different documents that I have to read. Because and so for me, I feel like, it may not necessarily be courses, but it's going to conferences and talking to people and hearing what they're saying that I think is very helpful for continued learning and professional development.
Thank you. That's great. Emily, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think also too, like, not just doing something to do it, like try to think about it as if you're building a skill to get to that next step of where you want to go. I would say, like, if you're already working in the field. So again, kind of like Greg was saying, like, do you want to get into more data or like data analytics, that type of thing, project management, which is a transferable skill across a bunch of different industries. So I think being a lot more mindful of sort of how will this skill help me to where I want to go next. So you're not just racking up certificates and it's not really getting you anywhere overall in terms of you kind of figuring out what you want to do.
Thank you. All right, so we'll put out a final call for any last final questions that you'd like to ask our speakers. If there's anything that you think of after the meeting, you can reach out to CTO and we can connect you with Greg, Margaret, and Emily for any questions after the session. But if there's no final ones, Say a big thank you to our three panelists today for taking the time out of your days to speak to our Research Ready community. Also, thank you to everyone who attended our session today. As a reminder, a survey will pop up on your screen once the meeting ends for the certificate of attendance. And then stay tuned for CTO's newsletter with information on our next Mentor Spotlight, which Greg, it's actually related to data management. So that's a good, good point there. But thank you everyone and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.